in Maya. Now, you're going to be building stuff and it's going to be a bit more detailed. And it might mean that you're having to make lots of selections of vertices or edges or things like that. And you don't want to be making the same tedious selections. Actually, I'm not going to start with a cube. I'm going to start with a plane. Say you've got to be selecting all of the, or a certain amount of lines in this all the time. You have to keep on going back and reselecting them. So I'll select them to begin with. So I've always got to be selecting those horizontal lines. I know I'm going to have to constantly come back and reselect them. I don't want to go through that process. Click, double click, click, double click, click, double click, all that kind of stuff. It just gets tedious. You can make a selection of virtually anything in Maya, and you can create what's called a quick selection set. And the way you do that is you select what you want to select, and you go create sets, quick selection set. It'll give you a name, and I'm going to give this a name, my edges. And go OK. That's going to do a couple of things. It's going to create this new little selection group here. And if you expand that, you can actually see all those edges. So I can click away from this. Now I can either select individual edges, you can see them highlighting, or I could select them all, and I've got my edges back. But even quicker, once you've created that selection set, in select, quick selection sets, there's that. Do that and it's instantly recreated that selection you've just made. This can be super, super useful when you're doing, I mean, imagine you're doing like an office block and you wanted to select all of these squares were actually like the windows in the office block. You've got to either individually go in and select the ones you want to select each time, or you can make a selection set. And Maya's quite clever, so that even when I add some more lines, I put a line just there, and a line just there. Now I've changed the geometry of this now. So these edges have technically, you would think they might be reordered, the numbers, because each edge, each polygon has a number. But it's actually fairly clever in that even though I've added some geometry, it still knows to select that edge in the middle that I originally selected. So that's selection sets. That works on vertices, that works on edges, and that works on polygons as well, or faces. Okay, so that's selection sets. I think that will speed up repetitive modeling and selection a lot. One thing you can do with Maya's obviously got this thing called a shelf, and there's a different shelf for sculpting, polymodeling, curves, you know, all that kind of stuff. Anything that you're using a lot in here, and you don't want to constantly have to go up to the menu, scroll down to what you want, and then click it. You can add it to this shelf. And the way you do that, there's a couple of things actually. This ties in with a couple of very frequent commands. As you're modeling, each thing you do gets remembered in here, like as it's remembered the split here, you know, remembered how I created the plane. Every single vertex, if you just move it, just nudge it once, that's a new operation. So every now and again you want to delete the history. So deleting by history is normally go to Edit, Delete by Type, History, or if you want to do it for everything, Delete All by Type. To speed this up, we can add that as a button onto the shelf. This works for anything you can do in the menu. You can make a button on the shelf. So the way you do that is you find the thing you want to make a button of, and then you hold down Control and Shift. And now when I click that command, history, it's added it to the shelf. So now whenever I want to delete the history on an object, instead of having to go to Edit, Delete by Type, History, I can just click that button and blasts that away. So you got that. That's pretty useful. I'm going to show you a couple of buttons I like to create to speed stuff up. One of the things is putting the pivot point of an object onto either a certain vertex or in the middle or the center of a bunch of vertices or edges or anything like that. Normally you'd have to do it like this. You'd have to go vertices, select them like that, and then go modify center pivot. So now when I go to object mode, that's where the pivot point now is, like this. But again, it's going over to there. So much quicker is to, I don't know, select that and now go to modify, control shift, click that. Now I've got center pivot. So now it's a lot easier for me to very quickly go, now I want the pivot to be there, or I want the pivot to be there. And when I go into object mode, that's where the pivot is. That speeds stuff up a lot. Because often as not, you want the pivot to be at the corner of an object. Now you can go the insert, hold down V, snap this around. Maybe you can do that just as quick. But if you can't do that as quick, you can create that little button, that center pivot button. Select anything, hit center pivot, and that's now where the pivot is. There's one more little button I like to create just here. You see down here in the channel box here, the translate X, Y, and Z. When that's at 0, that's the object where it was created. That's its kind of initial position, rotation, and scale. Sometimes, so if you move an object away from the origin and you want it back at the middle, you know that you can make that 0, 0, 0 like that. Sometimes you want to sort of reset all this to 0. Maybe you've moved this off and you want this to be the 0, 0, 0 point. You don't want the center point to be the 0, 0, 0 point. The command for doing that is modify freeze transformations. So if I hit modify freeze transformation, it's going to zero out this stuff. I'll scale it as well to show you, because the one thing that's different is scale. Translate and rotate will be 0, but scale, its default state will be at 1. So I'm going to make that big. And if I want that to be the default state of this, I would go modify freeze transformations. But again, I'm going to hold down Control and Shift. It's going to add that little button. So I can just click that now, and that all resets. So now if I move this around, and I rotate it, and I scale it, and I think, no, I don't like that. I need to get it all back to how it was. I can just 0 these out, and 1 these out, and it's back to where it was. So that was sort of two things. That was commonly, I mean, we should be aware by now about deleting the history of objects. So if you spend hours pushing and pulling vertices and extruding faces, hours and hours and hours doing that, you've got a huge list building up, and Maya begins to grind down to a halt. That's because you need to delete the history. So as we know, we can do it by going to here, but I think it's nice to have just little buttons up here that are much quicker to just tap, tap, tap. And absolutely any of these menu commands, if you hold down Control and Shift, it will create a button just here. But what settings? Some of these have got like settings on them, haven't they? Well, when you hold Control and Shift, it'll put that command onto the shelf with whatever settings you have set in here last. That might catch you out. So just be aware of that. If I think a useful one potentially is Mesh Tools has Insert Edge Loop. It's a little bit more in depth than the edge loop that you do with multi-cut. Because, let me just delete this. If I, oh yeah, just another one. If say you want to create a primitive, but you don't want to go up here, if you hold down Shift with nothing selected, hit Shift, right mouse button, gives you all your primitives. It's got a very useful one here called Create Polygon Tool. Expert level one, this one. Create Polygon Tool lets you click the vertices and create a brand new polygon object. So what I like to do is just start with a simple holding down X, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I've got myself a quick polygon like this. So I like that. So if you've got nothing selected at all and hold down Shift right mouse button, you get access to all of your primitive and more. But anyway, so you want to use this mesh tool here. Insert Edge Loop is a bit more fancier than this one, because with this one, if I open up the menu, I'm going to reset the tool. I've got the option of setting multiple edge loops. And maybe it's a common thing that I always want to take two edges and evenly split them up into 3 or 4. If I go into multiple edge loops and say 3, now when I click an edge, it just evenly splits them up. I'm just going to turn grid off. I might need to do that lots and lots and lots. Now that I've got that set up in Edge Tools, if I make a button out of that, then it's always going to split it by 3, like that. So remember, when you create a button on the shelf, it's going to remember the settings that you last put into here, or it's going to remember the default settings if you've never messed around with these settings. So yeah, creating buttons on the shelf. Okay, now the main bit. I want to show you this concept of deforming an object, and it's called a non-linear deformation. Non-linear deformers are useful because they're attached to your object, but they're also sort of not attached at the same time. It means that you can do an overall deformation on an object, but then you can still go in and make fine-tuned little edits to your object by extruding, beveling, or whatever like that. And your deformer, because it's not really connected to any of these components, will still apply that deformation to the overall object. And Maya comes with a whole bunch. Some are more useful than others, but I'll show you them all, and I'll show you one of the main uses for the bend deformer. So I'm just going to create a a cylinder, make it reasonably tall. To get smooth deformations, you're going to need enough geometry, enough subdivisions here to get a smooth deformation. This is not counting if you just hit 3, to make smooth preview, because if you've got a complicated deformation, even hitting 3 won't give you a smooth result. So you sort of have to support these deformations with enough subdivisions. So I'm going to create 20 subdivisions. So it's quite a smooth subdivided sphere. So I keep on saying sphere, cylinder. Non-linear deformers exist here in Deform, and there's just loads. Again, concept artists are going to touch virtually none of these ever through their entire career, unless they inexplicably decide that they want to suddenly become animators or something, because a lot of these are animation kind of tools. The only ones we're really interested in are in here, non-linear. Again, if you don't know this, see with this little dotted line here, if you click that kind of tears away the menu, so you can have that menu hovering. You don't need to go back up here. Right. You have an object selected, and you must have an object selected, or if you hit one of these, it will just error out. So let's look at bend first. You click bend, and nothing happens to begin with, but it has created a new little object, this kind of line, and it's selected it as well, and it's called bend one handle. If I go to the behavior here in the attributes of bend, it can also be seen in the channel box. If you click it just there, just a matter of preference, which one you prefer. You've got curvature, low bound and high bound. Bend's probably the most simple and most obvious what happens. If I increase this, it takes an object and it bends it 180 degrees in this case, even though it kind of looks like 360 in a way. It is actually 180, because if it was 360 it would try and bend it all the way back again and it would get a bit more distorted. So bend is pretty straightforward. You bend it, this is how much you want it to bend by. This is low bound and high bound are a bit like levels in Photoshop. They define where the start and end point of that bend is actually going to affect your object. So if you tweak this, you can see that it only starts bending from that point. Maybe you can see how useful this would be in creating kind of the beginnings of pipes and stuff like that. So that's what low bound does. High bound obviously just does the same on the other side. Here is a key point, though, to remember about non-linear deformers. The thing that makes the bend happen is completely separate to the cylinder itself. I can move this, and it's going to affect how that bends. I can rotate it, and it's going to you can create some odd results. So you can completely rotate and move this bend handle independently of the object. That is important to bear in mind. But what if you then want to move the object? But then again, because it's independent, if I move the object, it's going to mess up. Now, I could freeze this. Well, I could delete by history. That would work. You know, I've got the bend how I want it to be. I could delete by history, and it's going to destroy the bend handle, freeze it in this kind of bent state, and I can move it wherever I want. Maybe I don't want to do that. Maybe I want to keep this sort of live, and I want to change my mind later on what the bend values are going to be. In that case, what I've got to do is I've got to parent the bend handle to the cylinder, so that when I move the cylinder, the bend handle will move along with it. The way I do that is I middle mouse button on the bend handle, keep it pressed down, and I just move it over the top of the cylinder and let go. A little plus sign happens. Now the bend handle is a child of the cylinder, which means wherever I move the cylinder, the bend handle is going to move too. But because it's like it's what's called a hierarchy. So moving the cylinder moves them both, but I can still go in and move the bend handle, and that will have a different effect, because the bend handle inherits the movements from the cylinder, but the cylinder does not inherit the movements from the bend handle. It's a bit weird if you've not encountered this idea of hierarchies before. That's what hierarchies are. You can sort of visually see them. What the parent does, the child does, but then the child then still has some independence and can do what they want to do afterwards. Anyway, that's bend. I think that's the easiest, most straightforward one. And when you delete it, when you delete the bend handle, then this is no longer affected by the deformer. Right, let's have a look at flare. This comes up again with another little icon just here. And you've got this flare X, Y, and Z. So if I flare in X, it applies it that way. Z that way. And I can do it to the end points as well. This is ways of getting shapes that would be maybe a little bit tricky to model straight up. A curve allows you to control whether it flares in or out. And again, like bend, if I move this, it has an effect. You know, it's like it moving through the object. A lot of these deformers, my best advice in some ways is to just apply them to some objects and play with the values to see what happens. That's flare. Let's look at sine. Again, most of these won't do anything when you first click them on because they need some kind of value. Sine wave is going to apply a kind of wavy, two-dimensional sine wave that lets you do stuff like that. Wavelength is how long that wavelength, that wave is, that sine wave is. The smaller the value on wavelength, the more extreme that's going to be. You can see now why the lower the wavelength, the more geometry you're going to need in here. But you can always go back here and increase the geometry to get a smoother result. And this is another situation actually that shows off what they call non-linear deformers. Because I've applied this deformation, but I can still go right back to the beginning of when I created the cylinder and increase the resolution just here. By the way, if you don't know, you click on one of these and then in the viewport, hold down middle mouse button and left or right will then change the value of that. So a sine wave is like a 2D flat-on wave kind of pattern, where wavelength, you know, the longer the wavelength, the smoother and bigger that wave's going to be. Offset's quite nice. Offset sort of moves it through it. These get used a lot in animation. Drop-off is like, let's go back to, drop-off is sort of the object when it's closest, it's like the influence essentially, and how the power of the sine wave drops off as it goes away from the distortion back towards the center bit. So kind of drops off. It's a bit more, you know, a bit more fiddly. I don't know how much you would use it. And low bound and high bound, exactly the same as that bend and flare stuff. It controls where the start and end point are. So that's sine wave. or sine. Squash kind of scales your object, but maintains the mass of it. And you've got a lot of different, you control whether it expands or how it expands, and then you control. Again, you know, just play with these. Start and end smoothness, same kind of thing. Let's get rid of that. Twist. Oh yeah, twist is actually a bit more interesting to show. But twist will work better if I do it on a bunch of objects. I'm going to quickly actually, now that I've created these buttons, this is good because I want my pivot point to start just there. So I'm going to go to vertex, select that, center pivot. Now my pivot point's there, so I can now quickly snap this back up so it sits directly on the ground. And I want to position it there. And I'm going to duplicate it a couple of times. One. And I'm going to duplicate it again. Two. I'm going to put that just there. Now I'm going to combine these. That's the combine button. These are one object, and I'm going to delete the history. See the value of having these buttons up here and just getting used to what the buttons do, both the ones you make yourself and the ones that come with Maya. But anyway, with these selected now, this is one object. So if I applied a twist modifier to it, I'm going to select that, I can begin to curl these around in on themselves, create like a helix. Now you could model that. You could model that by creating curves and extruding other curves along those kind of spirally curves. But this twist is pretty handy for giving you a very quick, easy way of generating these helix, twisty kind of shapes. By the way, this envelope button that's on all of them, that's like an overall influence. At 1, that means the deformer completely overrides the model. It applies that deformation at 100%. But you can choose to only have that applied to a certain extent. And again, you can, hopefully you can see, you can create some really interesting abstract shapes using these nonlinear deformers. To model that polygon by polygon in that shape, I think would be pretty tricky and pointless when you can do it super easy. The last one is a wave. I'm just going to delete all of these and show you a wave on a plane. So a wave literally lets you sort of create a little water droplet kind of deformation on a surface. Again, you can't see anything until you actually apply some amplitude. It's quite sensitive as well by the looks of it. Let's put 0.5 wavelength. Actually, I'm going to create it on a bigger sphere, so it's just a little bit less sensitive. Let's put width 10, 10. Again, I'm going to give it a bit more resolution, just to make it a bit smoother. Wave, amplitude, like that. And then the offset literally sort of lets you almost animate that. You can see the pattern that the wave will be. And again, if you select that wave and then rotate it, it's going to change how it affects the object. So you can have like a 2D wave or a 3D wave. Let me just show drop position. Oh no, it's drop off position. So nothing will happen unless that actually happens. Oh, this is quite useful, yeah. So if you put drop off at 1, it means it gradually fades off towards the outside edge, which means you can have just a water droplet happening, and you can make sure that this outside border doesn't actually deform. But the drop off position lets you decide whether you want that smoothness to either be at the edge of the wave or at the beginning of the wave. So these are non-linear deformers, right? So the way you would potentially use these, the most usual way, is you've done some modeling, you've modeled something. I think if you're doing like the Mars base, so you're modeling some paneling and it's got to be curved, but at the same time it's got to be sort of what they call hard surface modeling. It's got to look sort of manufactured. Trying to model hard surface paneling around corners can be a right pain, and it can be a lot easier if instead you model it all flat and then you use these non-linear deformers to then deform them into shape. Right, I know your patience for this wears thin quite quickly, so I want to quickly move on to something that's going to pertain to the actual tasks I'm going to set you. I want to show you one new kind of command that lets you control the way edges flow around a surface. If I create a plane, the edges by default just go horizontally and vertically. There are going to be some cases where you don't want the edges to go horizontally and vertically. You want them to go diagonally instead. So what would be the quickest, most straightforward way of sort of reorientating these edges? Well, I can use actually selection sets as well in this sort of demo. I use a function called poke face. So first of all, I want to select all of my edges, but I don't want the outside border edges. So I'm just going to deselect those. So it's only these internal edges. Maybe that's, yes, a bit easier to see. It's only these edges I want to reorientate. Well, first things first, I'm going to make a selection set of those. So I'm going to go create sets, quick selection. I call it interior edges. That just created it just there. So I can deselect that, and I don't have to worry because I can always go back and select those. Now I want to select all these faces and use this new command that we probably haven't used before. Maybe you've stumbled across it when you've been working through it. It's called poke. And what poke does, as you can see down at the bottom, it's trying to show it down here. It essentially puts a vertex in the middle, in the dead center of a polygon, and then connects that vertex up with edges. And what it will make your object look like, or the polygons that you apply it to, is that. But this gets us halfway towards getting edges that run diagonally as opposed to horizontally and vertically. But now I want to get rid of all my original horizontal and vertical edges. Well, I created the selection set here, so that's actually quite easy. Just go in here, interior edges, and delete them. And remember, when you want to delete edges or vertices, you want to hold down Control and delete. And now I've got that kind of pattern. But why would you want this kind of pattern? What use does that actually get you? Well, you can do sort of effects like this. If I select all of those faces, with the exception of these ones on the corner, I can now extrude them, but do a sort of fancy extrude. If I do this at the moment, that sort of stuff's going to happen. Or I'm going to turn this to slowest. It's going to extrude it all as if it were one mass of polygons. It's going to connect all those polygons together and extrude them or offset them like that. See this here, keep faces on. If I want to treat every single one of these squares as if it was its own little individual panel and it was extruding on itself in towards the center, I've got to change this from together, keep faces together on, I've got to change it to off. So now when I do this offset, it's going to extrude it in like that. And for the purposes of what I want to just demo here as well, I also want to add in one extra subdivision. So I'm going to put 2. Now I can delete all of those faces. See what it looks like. I've got something like that. If I hit smooth, I get that kind of look. You can see how this is going to be useful for creating that sort of intricate detail that you might expect to see on futuristic kind of buildings and stuff like that, but also how easy it was to sort of get to this point, just knowing how to poke faces and make those selection sets. I want to give this whole thing a bit of thickness. So if I extrude while I'm in object mode, then it's going to give the whole object a bit of thickness, like that.